So, I'm a developer at Jump24, generally work with Laravel and Cake PHP. We use test-driven development. My Twitter handle's there, my email's there, personal website and company website are both there. We are hiring across the board, so if you're interested, get in touch. So, let's start with some new features for PHP 8. This is the fun bits, the bits that they've added. The first one is union types. Union types, they're there to allow you to define more than one type for both a parameter and a return. Couple of caveats on this. Return type void cannot be part of a union type, and nullable types can be done as both string null or question mark string. These are useful to have, but as a general rule, in PHP, for us, we'd rather go with a single return type. So although it's useful to have for legacy apps, the more recent stuff, we're not actually using this in Jump. The null coalesce upgrade. This one is absolutely brilliant. So we've all seen null coalesce used like this. So start date is booking get start date. If start date, then return as date times string or return null. But the Nonsafe upgrade lets you do this. So you can do booking get start date, question mark arrow as date times string. This allows you to use it with function calls, and it will return null or the result of the function call based on the information that's there. These can be chained, but it does not work with arrays, so you couldn't do this to access sub-elements of an array. It cannot be used to write data, only read it. So nice little upgrade. Actually implemented that in a couple of places today on an application. It's stripped out about 20 lines of code on a 4 deep chain. The next one is named arguments. So named arguments are great. In this example, we're adding together 4 numbers, but the last 2 are optional. Let's say that you have a set of 3 numbers that you want to use, and for some reason you really want the D to be 5, but you don't want to use the C and want that to be 0. With named arguments, you can pass those in by just passing in the named argument. They don't have to be in order, and you can skip over optional parameters. So, as I said, the ability to reorder parameters, so you don't have to follow the order that's there for the function. You can skip optionals if there's one that you need to use. You can use ordered and named together, but you can't have an ordered argument after a named one. And you can use the spread operator with named arguments, but the keys become the argument names, but you cannot have unrecognized ones or miss any required ones. Useful little feature for those functions that have got lots of parameters that are getting passed in, particularly DTOs. Attributes. This is one that seems to confuse a lot of people. So attributes allow you to define attributes without having to pass massive dot blocks. So this is an example of what an attribute might look like. You'd have an example attribute that you're passing into the bar function. So what does that actually mean for the real world? They're used to pass metadata. They're not designed to be used, nor can they be used for argument validation. The attribute you make must be annotated. That's to say, if you make an attribute class, it must have attribute declared. In the real world, you can have something like this. So here we've got a class root that implements a root attribute. The root attribute in this case is actually just an empty, what's the word for it? Yeah, I can't think of the word for it. The things that you implement. So here we're using a constructor to set up the attribute for roots. On top of that, we then create a get attribute. By using the get attribute, we're then setting up the constructor that passes through the values to the parent, which is in our case the root. And in this case, we can implement an attribute of gethelloboot, and this within Laravel will automatically register your boot for you. So rather than having this in the code in the root file, it can actually automatically implement this directly from the attribute. And yes, thanks Mark, it was interface was the word I was looking for. So Switch has also had an upgrade. Switch is still available, but you've now had an added one, which is match. So we've seen switch cases like this, where we do case 1, set your value, case 2, set your value, 3, 4 and 5, set your value, or default set your value. Lots of code there to do something that's relatively simple. This has been upgraded to give us match. That is pretty much the same code, except I'm returning it rather than assigning it to value. You can see there that you can return comma separated values to have multiples on a line. You can return defaults and you can return individuals, as you can see there. Match will not do type coercion, and unmatched values will throw an error. Property promotion. So we've all seen constructors like this. Here's a really simplistic person class. So you've got a public first name, a public last name, you pass in those values to the constructor, then you assign them to the variables. That code is quite long-winded and seems to repeat lots of variables for PHP 7. PHP 8 gave us this. That is exactly the same code. So in this case, public string first name within the constructor automatically creates the first name as a public string within the class, the same with last name. At the moment, you do still need the brackets for the function. You can carry on and add code in there that does other things with these variables or does other things that the constructor needs to. There is conversation ongoing on Twitter by several developers around, do we actually need those brackets? There's a request for comments available on that. General feeling is that they're probably not going to get removed. A lot of developers would be very surprised if they do get removed. It's a useful little feature, but at the moment only simple defaults are allowed. So you could have a last name of Miller, but you couldn't have a last name of new last name. There's some small improvements. So we have a static return type, which is really useful for identifying that you're returning a static version of the class that you're in. You now have a mixed type. This adds in the ability to just return a single type of mixed, where you just don't know what the value is going to be, and take in a mixed value. Throw is now an expression, not a statement, so you can use it in a lot more places. Private inheritance checks now throw an error. Previously they were just a warning rather than an error. These are interesting because it causes a lot of problems with some legacy apps where private inheritance hasn't been set up correctly. The class is now allowed on an object, which means that from an object you can draw back what the class is. Trailing commas are now allowed in parameter lists, which sounds like a really silly thing to add. In this case, it's actually useful, particularly for merge conflicts where you've been modifying a function. For some reason, having a trailing comma on things, GitHub and Bitbucket seem to do a better job of understanding that you've added rather than modified. Stringable interface, which is an internal function, an internal interface, now allows you to have toString automatically. Datetime objects can be created from the interface. You've got 3 new string functions: string contains, string starts with, and string ends with. They're really useful little functions that most people will have written with regex before now, and PHP have just included them now in PHP 8. Abstract function signatures are now fully validated. Previously, you could actually change the signature of an abstract function when implementing it. This will fully validate those and not allow that to happen. And the JSON extension is now precompiled in PHP. As of PHP 7, it was actually an optional extension. It's now a core extension. There is a lot of error level changes. So, undefined variable is now an error exception. Undefined array index is now a warning instead of a notice. Division by 0 gives you an error. Attempt to increment or decrement property of non-object is an error instead of a warning. Attempt to modify property of non-object is an error instead of a warning. Attempt to assign property is an error instead of a warning. Creating default object from empty value is an error instead of a warning. Trying to get property of non-object is now a warning instead of a notice. Undefined property is a warning instead of a notice. Cannot add element to the array as the next element is already occupied is now an error instead of a warning. Cannot unset offset in non-array variable is now an error. Cannot use scalar value as an array is an error. Only arrays and traversables can be unpacked is now a type error. Illegal offsets type in is set or empty is a type error. Illegal offset type in unset is a type error. Illegal argument supplied for each is a type error. Illegal offset for type is set or empty is a type error. Illegal offset type in unset is now a type error. Array to string warning is now array to string conversion is now a warning instead of a notice. Resource ID used as offset casting to integer is now a warning instead of a notice. String offset cast occurred, warning instead of notice. Uninitialized string offset is warning instead of notice. Cannot assign an empty string to a string offset is an error. Supplied resource is not a valid stream resource is a type error instead of a warning, and type error now thrown by many more internal functions. So all of those error upgrades do mean there are some considerable changes from PHP 7 to PHP 8. The vast majority of what we've been seeing are basically dealing with those errors, dealing with anything that was deprecated in PHP 7 and then removed in PHP 8, and dealing with other interesting little quirks like optionals before required parameters in functions. Generally, when upgrading from PHP 7 to 8, the key thing will be to deal with the deprecations first, then to deal with the error upgrades. So if you're not handling those errors, then start handling them, and to make use of the new features where they make sense. So for example, if you've got a massive long switch statement, replacing it with a match just kind of makes sense. Few other things that have been added. The @ operator no longer silences fatal errors. Good, because that was a bad thing going anyway. Fatal errors are never a good thing to hide. I have seen code in a previous employment where a fatal error has been hidden by the @ operator, and that fatal error was actually exposing PII data. The default error level is now EALL, so you'll see a lot more errors reported, but that's also a good thing because there's now a lot more things to fix to make your application more compliant with error management. The default PDO error level is error exception, so SQL errors will now throw exceptions. That again is a good thing, because if it's telling you something's wrong in a clearer way, you're more likely to handle those errors than you are to just let them pass. And PHP now has just-in-time compilation. That's a whole other talk, but long story short, it's nice, but most people aren't going to see a benefit. Where the just-in-time compiler comes into its own is when you've got repetitive tasks in a single process. So, For example, on a web application, you're very unlikely to have long-running repetitive tasks. You're more likely to have repeated calls to the same task. There is a benchmark talk out there that has compared PHP 5, 7 and 8 with the code for rendering a fractal. That has massively benefited from the just-in-time compiler, but quite honestly, I've never yet found a website that needs me to render a fractal. So that is an exceedingly brief overview of PHP 8.